Charli, Dixie, Trisha Paytas, and James Charles. Charli got called out for wanting 100 million subscribers, Dixie got called out for spitting out snails, Trisha Paytas then got involved and called them all out, and you know it wouldn't be a scandal without James Charles inserting himself into the situation. It was a mess, we've talked about it, we've been there, we've done that, so it should be over, right? Wrong. Trisha and Ethan posted a podcast episode the other day, rehashing the entire situation and spilling all of the tea. So, let's talk about it. When the D'Amelio family posted their dinner guest video that started this whole mess, a lot of people on TikTok were making videos about it. You really couldn't scroll down your For You page without seeing multiple videos on the situation. Then Trisha decided to jump on the trend and also react to the clip that was going around, which kind of blew the situation up even more. You guys know I've said this before, Trisha Paytas is like the drama channel of TikTok, so this really drew attention to the situation. She mentions that her video got 10 million views, but she still doesn't think it's fair that Charli and her fans singled her out because everyone else was doing it too. She says that she saw it trending on her For You page and everyone was getting a ton of views off of it, so she decided to talk about it. It's pretty clear that Ethan is kinda on Team Charli and Trisha is still holding her stance on the situation. Trisha kept saying that it wasn't about the snails or the followers and says that she was more put off by how they acted towards their parents for the entire video. According to Trisha, it was just really bratty behavior to display, especially during a pandemic when most people can't even afford to feed their families, let alone have a personal chef. She also brings up the fact that Charli is like one of the biggest personalities on the internet right now, and she also makes millions off what she does, so she's bound to be critiqued. Now, coming from Ethan's point of view, he thinks the reaction from the internet was way over the top, and the fact that Charli is only 16 and is only a year into her career, it was probably really hard and also stressful for her to process the whole situation. In Ethan's opinion, he says that it's pretty clear that it was a joke, mainly because in another clip when the chef brings the snails to Dixie, he tells her that if she eats it, it'll bring her good luck and prosperity. He says the fact that she spit out the food isn't rude to the chef because it was clearly a joke and they probably expected a reaction out of her. They went on to play Charli's Instagram live video where she called Trisha out, and Trisha claims that she actually would have stopped talking about her if she just had sent her a DM instead of singling her out on Instagram when tons of people were already talking about the situation. Ethan ended up bringing up a really good point in my opinion. He thinks Charli probably just mainly saw Trisha's TikTok since it got so many views and felt like she was an instigator behind the whole thing. Also, in my opinion, I'm sure her and James were talking about the situation because they are pretty good friends, and James was probably like, yeah, Trisha is a but that's just my opinion. Speaking of James Charles though, both Trisha and Ethan went off on him in this episode. Trisha says that she was fine with apologizing to Charli until James Charles just had to insert himself in the situation and start everything back up again. After Trisha apologized, the situation was actually starting to come to an end, and then James Charles got on Twitter and tweeted, "This Charli situation is not sitting right with me. 100 million followers in 1 year, and y'all expect her to know how to be a perfect role model? It's because she's a picky eater and made a joke about a milestone? 30-plus-year-olds dragging someone half their age feels familiar." Yeah. Clearly the 30-plus-year-old saying was aimed at Trisha, and I think we can all agree on that. Surprisingly, Ethan actually says that he agrees with the tweet that James Charles made, but he goes on to say that the only part he doesn't agree with is when James says it feels familiar. When James said that it feels familiar, he was clearly talking about the Jeffree Star and Tati Westbrook situation that happened over a year ago now. Ethan and Trisha called James a perpetual victim with a big ego. Moving on, let's talk about Trisha Paytas calling James out for being friends with a 16-year-old when he's 21. Ethan says to Trisha, like, you know that people are calling you out for being hypocritical since you did multiple collab videos with JoJo Siwa. Trisha explained that when she actually went over to JoJo's house to collab with her, Jason, and David, JoJo's mom was there at first, but ended up leaving. Apparently, Trisha felt really weirded out that her mom wasn't around, which is why she never collabed with JoJo again. She claims the difference between her and James is the fact that she only collabed once and then never again. And James is like best friends with Charli and constantly uses her, and she thinks it's really manipulative. In James Charles' TikTok, where he calls Trisha out, he says that he doesn't need Charlie and that she doesn't need him.
I don't need Charlie and Charlie does not need me.
He says he's friends with the entire family and not just Charlie.
I became friends with the D'Amelio family as a whole very, very early on because this is all very, very new to them, and I wanted to be a friend and a mentor in any way that I possibly could.
Ethan and Trisha both kind of side-eyed that statement because Trisha thinks that these young TikTokers actually kind of revived James Charles' career. Ethan brought up how James put Charlie front and center in his back-to-school knockoff Teddy Fresh photo shoot, yet didn't put any of her family in there, not even Dixie. In his opinion, that kind of shows that James does in fact need Charlie. Trisha says it's kind of the same thing that Tati did to James when he was younger. She thinks Tati used James, who was really young and was a rising influencer, to leech off his fame, and now he's apparently doing that to Charlie. Then they moved on to Jeffree Star. And you guys, this is where the tea comes in. They actually pulled up my video from last week where I showed this Snapchat of Jeffree.
What happened? I'm too busy worrying about me, myself, my family, and I don't care. I don't entertain it. So if you were friends with me and you're not anymore, keep my name out of your mouth.
I told you guys people were speculating whether or not Jeffree was talking about James Charles or Trisha. Now, if you guys watched that video, you'll know I said in my opinion, I think Jeffree was actually talking about Trisha because she's the only one that mentioned Jeffree's name. Well, Trisha and Ethan both think Jeffree was also talking about Trisha. Trisha made a comment along the lines of how she loves how he says that he doesn't care, yet still goes on and talks about it. After watching his Snapchat, they say that it was pretty scary, which I mean, honestly, it kind of was. And they also say that Jeffree is the type of person to hire an. Ethan asked Trisha who she thinks is on Jeffree's bad list, and she says James, Tati, Manny, and Laura Lee. But we already knew that. To end things off, Ethan and Trisha talk about how James Charles called Trisha out for a bunch of horrible things that she's done and said in the past, but how James has also done and said horrible things too. They played a TikTok that showed a bunch of offensive tweets that James made when he was younger. A lot of people have made an excuse for James that he was young, but other people think that's not an excuse for the things that he said. I think Trisha just thinks it's a bit hypocritical for James to call her out for her past when he also has a past. The comments under this podcast are surprisingly really positive towards Trisha, which is kind of